What I thought would be interesting to do was, now that we are kind of affixed in 6 railroads in the US and Canada and Mexico. First one alphabetically is the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. So we're going to look at that. And we're going to look in a little bit more detail at the components that were there in 1950. The Chicago Burlington and Quincy. That was because of Colorado and because of the boom and bust. It's the most convoluted history I've seen yet. So we'll kind of go through it. Just to review very quickly, again, Santa Fe was the biggest component of the BNSF. The Burlington was 8,800 route miles, and the CNS was 2,200 route miles. So that's why they always said the Burlington everywhere west, 11,000 miles of track. It adds up. Mm-hmm. So in 1950, the Burlington had 245 million in revenue, and the CNS had 35 million in revenue. So smaller. And in terms of equipment, the Burlington had a few more steam engines than diesels, but again, the diesels were multiple units, but they also had much higher availability. So I think probably they were about equal in terms of ton miles hauled. And the CNS had actually bought more diesels because, of course, they're in a dry area. Mm-hmm. So to review the Burlington, the first thing they did, obviously, was everybody's building from Chicago to Council Bluffs. In fact, there's 7 railroads crossing, 7 different lines crossing Iowa, going to Council Bluffs to meet the Union Pacific, because that was the big deal.
Sure.
And then the Burlington built to Kansas City and to St. Louis, and then down to Paducah. Here's all the Southern coal. And then they built up the east bank of the Mississippi River to St. Paul, and they got on the Great Northern, of course. And then they built this line out to Billings, which was a nice secondary main line for them. But then when the Colorado and Southern became available, they purchased it, and it goes from Wendover, Wyoming, through Denver, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, down to Trinidad, and then to a place called Tex Line. And then, of course, everybody, as we've talked about, all the railroads in Texas at the time had to be headquartered in Texas. So there's a railroad called the Fort Worth and Denver City.
Typical
and the
Texas.
Colorado and Southern took it over. So we'll look at the some of the railroads, because it's really convoluted. So the Colorado and Southern narrow gauge is this squiggly line like this that went over to Leadville, which was a big boom town. It's at over 10,000 feet. But anyway, they built across the place called the South Park. And then they also built a line down here and had to build the Alpine Tunnel, which we'll talk about, down to Gunnison, and then there was another mining thing there. So the squiggly line is the Colorado and Southern narrow gauge. The big line here, this is the Colorado and Southern standard gauge that came down from Wyoming to Denver. And then south of Denver, they built some track, and then they also got trackage rights on this joint line with the Santa Fe and the Rio Grande. So this is what everybody always talks about, the joint line. It's 2 different railroads. The Rio Grande, I think, owns one, and the Santa Fe owns the other, and the Colorado and Southern Burlington have trackage rights, but they operated as double track. And so they got down to Pueblo and then Wallensburg, and then they went down into Texas. So that's the Colorado and Southern. The next important line at the time, this is around 1900, is the Denver and Rio Grande. And this originally was narrow gauge down to Pueblo. And then they went up the Arkansas River through Tennessee Pass to Leadville. And then they built over to Grand Junction. As you can see, this whole area here is the highest plain in Colorado and the United States. I mean, the plates are pushing this way up. Mount Elbert is the highest point in Colorado. It's 14,433 feet. In fact, as I was doing this, it was interested to see the lowest point in Colorado is where the Colorado river leaves the state, and it's at 3,500 feet. So
Hmm.
that's the lowest point. So this state is a high plain, and which has caused a lot of problems. The Union Pacific went north, and they cross at 8,000, which is a problem, but it's much better than going at 10 or 11,000 feet.
Wow.
Okay, so that's the Denver and Rio Grande, and they went down here to Pueblo and over to Grand Junction. Then there was a separate railroad called the Rio Grande Western, which later the Denver and Rio Grande took over. But at this time, the Grand Junction to Salt Lake City was a separate railroad, and they did not have this line here yet, because this is the Denver and Salt Lake, which kind of wandered up here to Craig, Colorado, through Rollins Pass at 11,000 feet, and eventually they built the city helped them build the Moffat Tunnel because they thought it was important to keep that railroad going. They also built another railroad was built, the Colorado Midland, and that was a standard gauge line that went west from Colorado Springs across here again to Leadville. Everybody's going to Leadville, and then kind of wandered over here to Grand Junction, and then they connected with the Rio Grande Western. So, and the Colorado Midland was eventually, after World War I, was abandoned, and I'll explain why that happened. And then this black line here, this is the UP and the Burlington come in here, and then the UP also comes in down like this. That's the Kansas Pacific, and then the Rock Island comes in like this, and then runs on the UP into Denver. And there's a lot of Rock Island trackage in Denver. Kyle showed me around Denver, and I couldn't believe all these. I basically isolated pieces of track, and they had a lot of leaded industries. And then the gray is the Missouri Pacific, and then the blue is this purple is the Santa Fe, and then they also had owned part of the line up into Denver. But this is kind of this kind of will help us go through this because it is really convoluted. So a capsule of the history, the Denver, Leadville, and Gunnison became the Denver, South Park, and Pacific. This is the narrow gauge portion of the Colorado and Southern. And then there's the Colorado and Southern, the Fort Worth and Denver. It became a division of the Union Pacific. And then it was the Burlington purchased it. And then that, of course, became the Burlington Northern and then the BNSF. So that's kind of a capsule of the whole history. But the narrow gauge, we'll look at it. They built the line. These are all silver mines and metal mines. Black Hawk, Central City, Empire, Georgetown, Silver Plume. These are all, this is all silver mining. And then they built a line to Morrison. There were silver mines there. And then they built across this. This is called the South Park. It's a high plain southwest of Denver. And so they built across that, and they came up here like this over Boreas Pass at 11,000 feet, and then came down here to Climax, which was originally silver, but later became molybdenum. And that mine operated, I think until the 60s or 70s.
What is that?
A molybdenum is a very hard metal that they use in very high quality tools. You'll see the steel has a little bit of molybdenum in it, and I think they're using it for other things too. But it's an element, but it makes steel extremely hard. And so you'll see I have a pair of long nose pliers that say molybdenum contains molybdenum. And so this mine operated a long time, and then they got to Leadville. And then they built down here, and they got to some more mines here, and then down here to Buena Vista, and then they built the Alpine Tunnel, which we'll talk about. It was a disaster. And then got to Gunnison, and then some more silver mines. So this is the narrow gauge portion of the Colorado and Southern. And then they got into there was another standard gauge railroad that was built because the mining people here wanted another outlet because these guys were charging exorbitant rates. So they built their own railroad, the Florence and Cripple Creek narrow gauge that went down to Florence, and they connected with the Rio Grande. So it gave them a second outlet. So the entire Colorado and Southern, again, starts at this Burlington line here that goes up to Billings, Wendover, Wyoming, to Cheyenne, to Fort Collins, to Denver, to Colorado Springs, to Pueblo, to Trinidad, and then down here to Texas, And then this is the Fort Worth and Denver City. And then from Dallas and Fort Worth, they built to Houston and Galveston, and they jointly owned the Burlington Rock Island Railroad. So that's how the Burlington Northern Santa Fe got to Galveston. So again, the narrow gauge went across South Park from Denver to Leadville. It was a boom time and evolved into Denver, Leadville, and Gunnison. And that became the Denver, South Park, and Pacific. And that's, as I said, they built the line over Boreas Pass to Breckenridge, Dillon, Keystone, Climax, and Leadville. Now, the standard gauge portion, this was originally the Colorado Central and the Cheyenne and Northern. They formed this railroad, and then it was purchased by the Union Pacific, and it became the Union Pacific, Denver, and Gulf Railway. And they owned the Denver, Leadville, and Gunnison as well. Now, the big problem, as I said, it's extremely high elevation. And the problems that you have with snow, because there's also get a lot of snow too. A lot of those towns I mentioned are now big ski areas in Colorado. And that means you get big snow. So they kept building through this area, but the passes are horrendous. And I mean, when you're up at 11,000 feet, the Denver and Salt Lake was at 11,000 feet at Rollins Pass. And it took them 5 locomotives to get a 40 or 50 car train over the pass. It was just horrendous. And so, and it was closed down for weeks at a time. So eventually the city of Denver helped the Denver and Salt Lake build the Moffett Tunnel. And so that was down at 8,000 feet, which is much better. And they missed some of the big areas. The other problem that the Denver, South Park, and Pacific, which became the Colorado Southern, had is there were 3 railroads going between Denver and Leadville. You had the Rio Grande, which went down to Pueblo and came up this way. You had the Denver, South Park, and Pacific. And then you had the Colorado Midland come into this thing. So here's Denver, here's Colorado Springs, here's Pueblo. And so they built this railroad, standard gauge. It was the first line that went over the Rockies, standard gauge. And they built all the way to Grand Junction. And then they connected with the Rio Grande Western. So this was a standard gauge railroad. Unfortunately, like a lot of them, they were pretty lightly built. And as you can see here, here's a Colorado Midland train, standard gauge, coming out of a tunnel along one of their lines. And it was sold to the Santa Fe, owned it for a while in 1890. That's what I mean. This stuff was so convoluted. And then of course is the Rio Grande. Now I'll go through the Rio Grande. We talked about this is the joint line, which they still operate as a joint line. Now it's the UP and the Burlington Route Santa Fe, but it goes from Denver to Pueblo. And then from Pueblo, they go up through Tennessee Pass to Leadville, from Pueblo over here to Grand Junction. And then they eventually owned the line all the way to Salt Lake City. And so this was the Denver and Rio Grande and Western. So this is the standard gauge portion. This portion here was the Denver and Salt Lake, which went up here like this. And then the city of Denver helped them and built the Moffett Tunnel in the 1927, 28. And then the Rio Grande said, "Oh, this is a great line here. It's much better than going over Tennessee Pass." And so they petitioned and they had to go to court, and they eventually got permission to build from Osterod to Dutzero.
You know what Oristad means?
No.
It's .0 backwards.
Oh, okay. So there's .0 and there's Osterod.
Oristad.
Oristad? Oh yeah, it'd be Oristad. Okay. So anyway, they built, and this became the main line for the Rio Grande then, because it's much shorter.
Sure.
It's a lot lower, and the grades are much better. It's much better built line. This line is still it's still there, and it's still in place. The tunnel's in place, but as I understand, it's mothballed because it's just when the Tennessee Pass tunnel here is at 10,500 feet or something. I mean, and whereas the Moffett's only a little over 8,000, so that's a big difference. Plus anytime you got to raise freight 2,000 feet, that's a lot of fuel.
Yeah.
And then all this portion down here is all the narrow gauge stuff. So,
Okay.
okay, so that sort of help kind of give a little baseline because it is.
I know all this stuff.
Huh?
How do you know all this stuff?
Oh, I've read books because it just I couldn't. And the more you get into it, you go, oh my gosh, it's more convoluted than I realized.